Are the Gospels historically reliable? Well, before we can answer this question, we must first answer a more fundamental question. What do we mean by reliable? Now, that might seem like a simple question, but it's really not. Does it mean that in order to be reliable, there cannot be any errors whatsoever? Well, certainly that can't be the case, because if it were, well, then nothing would be historically reliable. Apart from Scripture, you couldn't say anything in the Greco-Roman or any literature would be historically reliable. So how many errors would be allowed before it's not historically reliable? 1%, 2%, 5%, 10%? And what kind of errors would we allow? How many big ones? Or if you have one big one, would that be the equivalent to 10 or 15 little ones in the insignificant peripheral details? How do you answer that question? And then it's more than that. It's like when you're talking about ancient biography, the genre of ancient biography is different from modern biography. It's got the same word, biography, but they operated by some different literary conventions. They had different objectives. So whereas today in biography, a modern biographer will try to talk about psychological and cultural and societal, environmental items that led the person to develop into the kind of person they are. Whereas in antiquity, they believed that a person was born with a specific character. That character didn't develop over time. It manifested itself more over time. So you don't have this psychological thing. That's why in the Gospels, as well as other ancient biographies, they usually talk about the person's family, ancestry, and then they launch right into the person's public life, whether it be military, politics, or teacher, whatever. And that's why the Gospels don't talk about the childhood of Jesus. It's not interested in talking about the psychological development of that person. That wasn't the objective. The objective of ancient biographers was to take and paint a literary portrait of who that person was. And they would manifest or illuminate who that person was through their words and their deeds. Okay? So they would be selecting the material, and this portrait they're painting, they want you to get an impression of who this person was. So like Plutarch, he's the greatest of all the ancient biographers. When he's writing his life or biography of Marcus Brutus, one of the conspirators who assassinated Julius Caesar, he is painting the portrait of Brutus as a pretty nice guy. He's not brutal like a lot of the other Roman elites were. He wasn't corrupted. But Brutus wasn't innocent on a lot of things. He did some corrupt things. He was brutal at times. But in his biography of Brutus, Plutarch doesn't describe those things. He doesn't include those because it would complicate his literary portrait of Brutus. So you don't get an exact, precise, or I should say, he could be telling all truths about Brutus, but the portrait, the impression we get on who Brutus was, has been airbrushed. A modern example, or hypothetical example, I should say, would be let's say you have a modern biographer who's writing a biography on Martin Luther King Jr., and the objective of that biography is to encourage others to help the oppressed. And in doing so, that biographer talks about all the great things in the civil rights movement that Martin Luther King Jr. did, but doesn't make mention of his numerous marital infidelities, because that would complicate the portrait of MLK Jr. So let's say everything in that biography was correct, was accurate, but those marital infidelities were omitted in order not to complicate the portrait. In other words, the impression we get on who MLK Jr. was has been airbrushed. So if everything's correct, but it's been airbrushed, the impression we get, is it historically reliable? How do you answer that? You could say yes with an asterisk. It requires qualification. So there's a lot that goes behind the question, are the Gospels, or for that matter, any piece of ancient literature, historically reliable? And it's a lot to get into. I can't do it right now. So rather than talk about that, I want to give you a simple definition of historically reliable as follows. At the very minimum, historically reliable means that it's preserving an accurate gist of what occurred. Now, I realize that gist can have a variety of meanings to it on like a spectrum, but I'm referring to saying the literature in question gives us the main and essential parts that they are true. The main and essential parts are true. It's giving us an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. At minimum, it meets that standard. And that would apply not only to the Gospels, but to all ancient literature. When we say something is historically reliable, it at least meets that minimum standard. It might be far better than that, but it at least meets that minimum standard.